Okay, hi. I want to continue where we left off yesterday, and we left the New Deal, and we were looking at American foreign policy. American foreign policy that would begin at the end of the war and take us up into the beginning of World War II. It is incredible, I think, in terms of hindsight, as we look at this material, that we could have a Second World War within a period of about 20 years, that we would have a repeat of World War I. In fact, a far more savage, a far deadlier and destructive war than even World War I. And I think that as we were looking at foreign policy, one of our goals was to try to divine, if we could, what could have happened between 1918 and the armistice of World War I and 1938 that would allow a second conflagration to occur in the world. We were looking at it obviously from the view of America. And I think that as we move through this material, we can see that it's not just hindsight, that there were those who lived during the 1920s and 30s who could see that the way that the world was moving, that war probably at some point would be inevitable. There were signs early on. One of the basic problems, I think, and America has been accused by Europeans of being responsible, or at least bearing a great responsibility for the war, was that it did not take an active role in the League of Nations, in the dealings of the League of Nations. Because keep in mind that indeed the objective of Wilson's League of Nations was to make war obsolete. That was the cornerstone of Wilson's 14 points. And I guess what I find also amazing is that when we look at Wilson's 14 points, if we wanted to do that, we could see that Wilson's view of the world and what the world needed to avoid a Second World War, and that he was right. That you needed a strong association of both great and lesser nations to ensure peace. That you needed a strong world court. But in order for that to work, for that to keep and preserve the peace in the post-World War I period, most countries felt that America had to be an active participant. After all, this was America's brainchild. And yet, as we looked at the last time, America is not a part of the covenant of the League of Nations. And therefore, the League of Nations did not have the support. It was like a chair with three legs minus the fourth. America could have been destabilized and influenced had it become an activist country from the beginning. This is not to say, however, that the U.S. was not interested in world events. I tried to point out that while there clearly was some isolationist sentiment. The U.S. was interested and understood that it could not avoid world responsibilities. It could not retreat to its continental shores. So in ways that it could, the U.S. government, which would always be hamstrung well into the 30s by this strong isolationist sentiment, would do what they could, I think, and which was not enough, to stem a growing tide of aggression among certain countries, in particular Germany, Japan, and Russia in the post-World War I period. Even before the war actually is over, the U.S., and I think we talked about this at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, that there has been this, there was this ambivalent relationship between Japan and America. On the one hand, the Americans saw the Japanese as a possible ally in maintaining the open door policy. On the other hand, there was this recognition that the Japanese had visions of creating its own empire, which came later to be known as the New Eastern Order. It was clear that Japan really had not been totally committed to the Allied cause during World War I and had only joined the Allies to advance its program of expansion that will continue in the 1920s and 30s. Almost immediately, the Japanese, when the war was over, took advantage of the war to seize some crucial and critical islands in the Pacific, the German islands and German possessions of the Carolinas, the Marianas, and the Marshall Islands. Yes?
Are you talking about the end of
World War
I?
Yes. Actually, this is even before the war ends. We can see the Japanese making it very clear that they want a larger role in the world. And for reasons, I think, that were made clear to them by the Russo-Japanese War. One of the things that, even though the Japanese are credited with winning the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905, it was clear that it exposed a fundamental weakness that the Japanese had to overcome if they were going to become a player like America, Britain, France, and Russia. And that was to overcome its status as a dependent country on other countries for economic resources. We talked about that. An island empire that did not have an abundance of natural resources that would allow it to become a major power. We saw that when we looked at how certain things had changed the nature of warfare and became important. For instance, oil. And I mentioned oil because in the end it will be the last straw that will precipitate the break between America and Japan will be over the commodity oil. That oil no longer was simply used as a lubricant. Oil, as the British put it, Oil was as precious as blood and would be as precious as blood in any coming war. So there was a mad scramble immediately after the war, which the British, the French, and the Americans benefited from, to get control of the oil fields in the Middle East. Japan, yes.
I was going to ask. So basically, the Japanese had to get over the weakness of economic dependence.
Economic dependence in terms of the availability of natural resources. I mean, we will look at if there's one consistent thing that we see throughout this entire period, it will be the Japanese making the decision whether to expand to other islands to make up for resources that they are increasingly denied by America. So definitely, it is their Achilles. Natural resources, if we look at a country, for America, that was America's strength. Okay? For Japan, it was their Achilles heel. It was their weak spot. And they understood this. They understood that they could not win wars of attrition. They could not be a great nation because of the limitations of being a dependent country on natural resources. Even as we will see, even sports. I mean, I'll talk about this in a moment, but I can mention it now. I mean, golf in Japan became a very popular sport in the 1920s, but only the very, very wealthy could play golf because of the limitations of land. Even to this day, golf is an extremely popular sport in Japan, but most people don't play on golf courses. They simply go to hitting ranges because of, again, the lack of space, the lack of land, the lack of resources. And I think this is important. Geoeconomic determinism will push the Japanese in certain directions. And there are other factors too that I think, as we will see as I move on. But, and I think one of those factors I should mention is that the Japanese, as early as the 1860s, had come to admire and resent. It was always this double-edged sword. They came to both admire and resent the Western world. They admired, for instance, the modern Navy, the Western military strategy, and the way that the West conducted military campaigns. On the one hand, they admired it. On the other hand, they resented it because in the 1860s, they were forced by the Americans to sign a trade treaty they didn't want to sign. But their military was vastly inferior to Commodore Perry's. Now, the Japanese, while they would resent it, would begin to move to imitate, to reorganize their whole military to make it like the West. So you had that love-hate relationship there on both sides. I would think both the Americans and the Japanese had this kind of love-hate relationship. In fact, when the war breaks out, if you look at the Japanese Navy and the Japanese Army, it is modeled after the West. It is modeled after America and Britain. So, I mean, there is this love-hate relationship that we will talk about in a moment. And maybe that will account for some incidents that will happen during the 20s that will account for this increasing bitterness toward the Americans. For instance, I think the Japanese expected the Americans to understand that somehow they were like them and they had a right to expand like the Americans had become a big power. In 1915, for instance, the Japanese began what would be the beginning of years of incursions, invasions, and assaults on China. In 1915, before the war was over, the Japanese had already presented China with what was called the 21 demands. These 21 demands were forced on the Chinese government. These demands, as they stood, would have seriously compromised Chinese territorial integrity and sovereignty, especially in South Manchuria and Eastern Mongolia. The U.S., understanding this, challenged the Japanese to back off. Now, what was interesting was that these 21 demands, the Japanese got the Chinese to sign it, and it was supposed to be a secret agreement. But the Chinese found a way of leaking it out so the world would know what was happening to them by the Japanese. And once the Western world and America found out that they were being coerced into signing these so-called 21 demands, the Japanese reluctantly, bitterly, sullenly withdrew some of the more odious, some of the more objectionable of the demands they had made on the Chinese people. This was in 1915. The Japanese were angry because they argued that just like the Americans argued, they had a special relationship with Latin and South America that had been embodied in the Monroe Doctrine and those kinds of documents, that they too had what they called a, quote, special contiguity with China and Manchuria. That is, this notion of contiguity means a closeness. Contiguity is closeness. They have a special closeness in much the same way that America had its closeness with Latin and South South America. But the U.S. didn't see it that way. Bryan, who was then obviously the Secretary of State under Wilson, refused to recognize any of the remaining 21 demands, and issued, as it would over the years, the first of its warning to the Japanese to respect Chinese integrity. There were other early, but the Japanese, I should point out, ignored the U.S.'s protests, Bryan's protests against the 21 demands. They ignored the U.S. non-recognition of their special contiguity with China and especially Manchuria, and went ahead with their program. There were other problems too with the Japanese that had deep roots, I think, between the U.S. And Japan. Japan was a very sensitive nation when it came to the subject of race. It may well have been that because of the apparent Western superiority in technology and in economics, that somehow, and because during the Russo-Japanese War, there had been some condescending remarks made about the Japanese along racial lines as being inferior. In fact, we looked at the Gentleman's Agreement under Roosevelt, 1908. The Chinese never forgot the Gentleman's Agreement. The Japanese never forgot it. They never forgot how Roosevelt forced them to voluntarily stop allowing coolies, as they called them, to travel to America. They were always racially sensitive. We can see this even during the covenant of the League of Nations. The Japanese will insist that a statement be included in the covenant of the League of Nations that will denounce discrimination against Japanese immigrants. In fact, they want a statement in which the League of Nations will go on record as supporting racial equality throughout the world. That's interesting. If you think about it, you don't think of the Japanese pushing for something like this, because in recent history, there is an image of the Japanese as a people who assume a kind of racial superiority over other people. But here they are now asking the League of Nations to include a statement that would recognize racial equality and would not discriminate against Japanese immigrants. Well, Britain primarily was opposed to any such statement. Why do you think the British were opposed to such a statement? Because the British didn't want this to get out. If you issued a statement supporting racial equality, would this not have a rippling effect in the countries that it had colonized, like India? They didn't want to open a racial Pandora's box, so they got Wilson to block the inclusion of this statement. So it failed. Well, the Japanese were not happy about that either, and took offense to that in 1919. But that was not the end of it. The Japanese saw offense again in 1924, when America decided to now pass the National Origins Act. Under the National Origins Act, and I should point out that the U.S. here at this point, while they had opposed the statement for racial equality, and I think, just to be quite frank with you, I think Wilson may have opposed it for reasons other than just because the British wanted him to. What about America's racial policy? After all, would it not have implications for the system of Jim Crow that existed in the South for more than 4 million people of its own people? So I think it was perhaps more than just the British urging them on. They had their own vested interest in not allowing this Pandora's box to be opened. It may come back to bite them in, as they say, the derriere too as well at one point. at some point. But the Japanese were also upset about the National Origins Act, because under the National Origins Act, the Japanese would get an annual quota of 250 Japanese a year. Well, this too was insulting to the Japanese. They would not forget this insult. Again, as I indicated, few people at this time were more race conscious than the Japanese in the world. Well, the Japanese responded to Wilson's sabotage of their of that statement that would have been included in League of Nations. They called Wilson a hypocrite because of the Southern policy. They even called him a transformed Kaiser. They called America a hypocrite because of the 1924 National Origins Act too as well. But the Americans had their own hostility toward the Japanese. The Japanese thought that the Americans were hypocrites. The Americans, for some reason, saw the Japanese as tricky, maybe because of the way they attacked the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. They had characterized the Japanese as wily, tricky, fight-thirsty people, especially once the 21 demands had leaked out in China. And then there was the whole incident. You see, these are a lot of little incidents. What happens during 1919 when there is a civil war in Russia? In Russia, you have a civil war between the whites and the reds, and the U.S. under Wilson will send troops to oppose the Bolshevik forces in Russia. The U.S. will send troops to Russia to participate on the side of those who opposed the Bolsheviks. But it wasn't just his only reason for sending troops to make sure that the Bolsheviks, or he hoped, it backfired. It was a terrible backfire, because not only is the White Army beaten, but the Red Army will emerge victorious. And they will always hold that against the Americans too as well, for their interference in the Civil War. But the U.S. had a second agenda, and that agenda was to block any further Japanese expansion in Manchuria, because they knew the Japanese, they said, that they would use this as an opportunity to get more land from northern Manchuria. Well, by 1921, with the Germans defeated, Americans had generally settled on Japan not really as a friend, but as a rival. And it was a rival that it had to watch and be wary of. A number of books in the 20s, early 20s would come out expressing, years before World War II, this concern about Japan. For instance, Frederick McCormick's book, The Menace of Japan. And a lot of this was laced, I should point out, with racial overtones. The Menace of Japan. And Walter Pitkin's book, Must We Fight Japan, which he argued that at some point it was going to be inevitable that the U.S. and Japan would find themselves on a collision course, and they would fight. But this is 1921. In the early 1920s, we have this attitude toward the Japanese, which is somewhat remarkable. Well, I think just to explain what was happening to Japan in the 20s, I think this attitude toward the National Origins Act was a part of what was taking place within Japan itself. By the turn of the century, under the leadership of the Meiji government, Japan was now being rapidly transformed into a modern industrial society modeled after the West, I should point out. They even believed that the way that you expanded was much like that in America. You used commercial expansion to extend one's influence. In the early 20s, businessmen seemed to be the leaders in Japan. Okay? In the 1920s, Japan adopted a great deal of Western culture. That is this ambivalence. And maybe that is why they resented the Americans so much, because they admired them so much on the one hand, and yet they were dismissed and insulted by the Americans on the other. For instance, in the 1920s, we have a parallel. We call the 1920s in America the Roaring Twenties. Well, they had the Roaring Twenties too in America. In Japan. They had the flappers, the girls who did the dances. They were called the mogai. They were the equivalent to the female flappers. The male equivalent of the mogai were the the mobu. And they danced, and they had cabarets. They loved jazz. Jazz was huge in Japan during the 1920s. In the cities, let me point that out, in the cities and the urban areas. I think that's clearly, I should make that point. Okay? They loved American Hollywood. They couldn't get enough of American movies in the 1920s. They loved golf, although baseball was their great pastime. This was an American or Western import. They read American literature, English literature, and the Japanese became very interested in science. The problem, though, was that the roaring Japanese 20s was more confined to the cities and the urban areas than the vast rural areas of Japan. We talk about paradoxes in America. Well, we have a paradox almost the same that's happening in Japan. While the cities are becoming modernized, heavily influenced by the West, the rural areas are denouncing this the same way the fundamentalists denounced the progress, these actions in America. You have a class of Japanese who denounce now everything that is Western. Everything that is Western is corrupt. This was particularly true in the rural areas of Japan. And why is this important? Because at the same time that business promises Japan a new future, a new power through commercialism, there is a group that will gradually begin to expand and soon come to dominate the Japanese by the middle and late 20s, and that will be the military. In the rural countryside, Western culture is held in contempt and scorn. Instead, in the 1920s, there is a growing group who are now criticizing business as taking them on the wrong path for expansion. They now begin to worship. The military begins now to push an ultra-nationalistic program. Slowly, the military will come to dominate the rural areas of Japan. There they will find peasants who have not benefited from any Japanese prosperity. They are poor, they have no dignity. What does the military offer them? It offers them a chance to be somebody. It offers them a chance of belonging to something that is very special. And as a result, you begin now to have the military slowly but steadily recruiting a whole generation of soldiers from the peasants who virtually owe their lives to the military by the 1930s. They are thoroughly indoctrinated with an ultra-nationalistic philosophy that is held together by what is called Shintoism. Shintoism is a cult of worship of the emperor. They will elevate the emperor of Japan almost to a supernatural being, in which these 14-year-old boys, because they began to recruit among the peasants, they recruited boys who were 14 years old who virtually would spend their entire lives in the military. And from 14, they would be indoctrinated with this ultra-nationalistic sense that they are a part of something special, and that in the end, it would be the army that would lead, it would be the military that would lead Japan to greatness, not the business community, not the politicians, not later the Diet, the parliamentary system in Japan. It would be the military, and they would be a part of it. And to hold them together, this belief was the worship of the emperor, which becomes known as Shintoism. Yes. Well, business had been able to sort of hold the military at bay, the civil government, the business sector, until the Great Depression. The Great Depression took its toll on the Japanese. In fact, the Depression in Japan came 2 years earlier than the Depression in America. The Japanese blamed the Depression in Japan on the high tariff rates that the West imposed against them. And as the Japanese economy sputtered, stumbled, and collapsed, they blamed the West for their woes. This gave the military during the middle and late 20s into the 30s. This gave the military now the opportunity to argue that they should return to the old program of colonial expansion. Forget about this notion of commercialism. That hadn't worked because of the hostility from the West. That military expansion was the only way to guarantee Japanese greatness. And that the only way that you could have expansion would be through the military seeking and bringing into the Japanese government or Japan new colonial possessions. Because if you were able to get these colonial possessions, then you would become what? Self-sufficient. The Japanese were very much aware that they had been dependent on the West and particularly on America for a number of important commodities. And they resented that too, because here are people who had, I guess in the vernacular of the street, had dissed them, okay, racially. And yet they had to do what? Get their resources from this country. Business expansion failed. Let's try the old way. Let's go back to military expansion. Let's go back to the taking of colonies and possessions so they could be self-sufficient and be invulnerable as a world power. The civilian government underestimated the growing military phenomena in Japan. They underestimated the incredible control and grasp that the military had on a generation of young Japanese boys who would in the end be willing to blindly give their lives and follow blindly the orders of their commanders without question, no matter how barbaric or how terrible the order was. By 1931, as we will see, military expansion in Japan was well underway. But that is what is taking place in the 20s in Japan. Still, back in America, in the early 20s, we have the U.S. trying to disarm the world through a series of treaties that we talked about, beginning in the early 1920s. The first one was a conference called by Charles Evan Hughes, who was the Secretary of State. The most important of this was the 1921 Five-Power Treaty. This also will reveal, everything we talk about will reveal tensions between the U.S. and Japan almost on every issue. I think this tells us a lot. In 1921, Hughes invited, yes?
Who did you say came up with the Five-Power Treaty?
Charles Evan Hughes is the one who called for a Washington conference in 1921, which will result in the five-power treaty. Actually, he initially only invited 3 countries. It was to be the U.S., Britain, and Japan. But not to offend the French. The French were invited later, and China, Belgium, and another country, and a couple other countries. But it's still referred to as the five-power treaty because it basically will apply to the U.S., Britain, Japan, France, and Italy. Okay. Now, what was the five-power treaty? Remember the notion that you could not have a war if the countries did not enter an arms race. So at the beginning, the first day of this conference, Secretary of State Hughes announced that he was going to scrap. He was going to voluntarily destroy 30 American ships. Just get rid of them to show that the only way to have peace was to disarm, to get rid of stockpiles of weapons of destruction. Then he asked Britain and Japan to make similar cuts in their fleets to follow suit. He has set the example. Would they join him in this move to take the tension out of the world, to disarm by destroying these ships? Well, one critic made the comment that when Hughes said that he was going to destroy 30 American battleships, that Hughes had sank in 35 minutes more ships than all the admirals in the entire history of America in 35 minutes. Well, the Japanese balked. The Japanese said, well, you want us to cut back. Well, how's this going to work? Well, the U.S. said, well, what was fair would be a 5-5-3 ratio in terms of tonnage and in terms of the destruction of ships. That is, the U.S. and Great Britain would get a chance to keep more ships, build more ships in a ratio than the Japanese, who would have a ratio of 5 to their 3, okay, in terms of tonnage. The Japanese wanted, well, they had to have 3. Why couldn't it be a 5-5-5 deal? You know, I mean, the U.S. went into some serious negotiations with the Japanese to get them to accept the 5-5-3. The Japanese will accept, but the U.S. will pay a far greater price for their acceptance than they would realize at the time. The Japanese said, okay, we'll accept the ratio of 5-5-3 in terms of tonnage. Although the problem with this whole thing that they excluded so many categories of ships as to make it almost meaningless. You could get around it. It didn't, for instance, cover submarines. It didn't cover cruisers. It covered aircraft carriers. It covered the battleships, the biggest ones, but it didn't cover a whole lot of other ones. But the Japanese said, we'll go along with it if, in fact, you promise us that you will take no steps to fortify and arm any of your other possessions in the Pacific. That is, you would not create naval bases in the Philippines, in Guam, on the Wake and Aleutian Islands. Yes.
Is this both Britain and
No.
just the United States?
This is just the U.S. The U.S. is making this concession. Now, keep in mind, it's clear that the Japanese also see the U.S. as what? Their major adversaries in the Pacific, not the British or the French. Okay? It is the American presence in Hawaii, in the Philippines, that control the resources that they need. Now, keep in mind what they're asking the U.S. to do. And this will come back to bite them, believe me. They agree not to create naval bases or military installations in the Philippines. Why did America get the Philippines in the first place? They annexed it because of its what? Of its strategic location. Hawaii was not a real strategic location. The Philippines were a strategic location. So were some of the other islands. Guam and some of the other islands. Well, if the U.S. agreed not to place a military presence on these islands, if the Japanese ever attacked, the U.S. would be in no position to stop them. Which is exactly what would happen in 1941. It is a terrible mistake and a bad deal on the part of the U.S. to get the Japanese to sign this five-power treaty, which they went ahead and ignored anyway. And they didn't like it anyway. Well, the treaty itself, as I said, was already weak. They agreed to scrap some existing naval vessels, and the ratios, as I indicated, for tonnage of battleships was established 5-5-3. That the U.S. and Britain would have bigger battleships. They would have more tonnage than the Japanese. Well, as I indicated too, the smaller vessels were not covered, and that was a big loophole. I should also point out that the French were upset too. The U.S. would have a 5-5, the Japanese 3, and they delegated to the French a 1.7 ratio. And the French were very upset about it. They grumbled, they spit, and they had tantrums, but that's really that was about all they could do. And so they accepted it. The notion was that the British did not the French did not have the potential to create a great navy anyway. It was far more concerned about creating a large standing army. And in fact, the French will create the largest standing army on the eve of World War II. They will have more than 800,000 men in uniform. Now we'll have to ask the question how they got run over so easily. Well, we'll look at the French and when we get to the close to the war. Well, then you had, right after the 5-power treaty, you had a 4-power treaty. Now, all this did, and make this very quickly, all the 4-power treaty did was that each nation, the U.S., the British, the French, and Japan, they all agreed to respect each other's possessions in the Pacific. Okay? That each nation, the French, the British, the U.S. and Japan would agree to respect each other's possessions in the Pacific. Then you had the Nine-Power Treaty right after that one. This one obviously included 9 powers. I don't have to go through all the names. But the ones that we just talked about, plus China, Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal. Well, these 9 countries simply agreed to support an open door policy toward China. Okay, that they agreed to support an open door policy toward China. I mean, you have to really look at this as sort of, these treaties were naive. I mean, they were naive to begin with. How can the Japanese support an open door policy to China when it's already what? Trying to force 21 demands in 1915 on the Chinese, and have already said that that they have a special contiguity with the Chinese. This is the failure of American policy. It's trying to do what? Create policy in a vacuum without any power to enforce it, without any coercive power. And then we have probably the biggest act of self-delusion that you could have had in the 1920s, and that was the passage of the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. The background to this was that the French minister, Aristide-Briand, asked the Americans to join an alliance against the Germans. The French were never satisfied with the treaty, even though they would be able to impose, and they did impose, some very harsh reparations on the Germans after Wilson was defeated. They are still never what? They are never comfortable. The only way that the French would have been comfortable with the British and with the Germans anywhere in the world, on the planet, would have been if they simply occupied Germany forever. Because they had had 2 bad experiences with the Germans. First, the Franco-Prussian War. And in truth, the French were whipped. The French were whipped by the Germans in World War I. It took them very little time to occupy northern France. So I suppose in many ways the French were paranoid. They were afraid of the Germans. That is why you have an 8,000-man army and this elaborate construction called the Maginot Line, which is supposed to be impenetrable, which no invading army was supposed to be able to get over. And the Germans would get over pretty easily, as we will see shortly. I'm not trying to talk about the French, but they need to be talked about. Well, the French foreign minister, you keep in mind that this lecture is from an American perspective. Now, we're not teaching French history here, so this is an American perspective. And I don't apologize for it. Well, the Secretary of State, who was now a man by the name of Frank Kellogg, who had replaced Charles Evan Hughes in 1925, Frank Kellogg said, "Well, just as he wasn't. We're not going to join in any alliance against the Germans." But what he did was he took Aristide's request and turned it around. He said, instead of creating an alliance against Germany, why don't we agree to condemn war as a recourse to the solutions of international controversies. Okay, why don't we, instead of an alliance against Germany, why don't we all, in the spirit, condemn the recourse to war as the solution for resolving international controversies or problems between countries? Oh, that sounded so nice. In other words, countries would renounce war as an instrument of national policy. That they would renounce war as an instrument of national policy. Well, 28 countries signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But in truth, it very quickly became sort of an international joke. As one person could put it, it was the equivalent of an international kiss and hug and make up between the countries. As one American senator put it, of Virginia, Senator Glass, he said, look, he said, none of my constituents is simple enough to believe, simple-minded enough to believe, to suppose that this treaty is worth the postage stamp that was mailed in. In other words, this was absurd. That countries, what it did, he argued, it was, and in fact, it wasn't just a harmless act. The Kellogg-Briand created this delusion that people could act this way in terms of war nobly. That what would happen, and this was included in the pact, and this is what destroys the whole thing. What about, okay, I renounce war as an instrument of national policy, but what if I'm attacked? What if it's a defensive war? Would I not have the right to defend myself? And they said yes. So now you give everybody an out. All you simply now do is not to declare war on anybody. You simply argue that you're now what? Defending yourself against the aggressions of another country. So you just, it just merely outlawed declarations of war. It was weak, but it was dangerous too, as military people looked at it, because in America and in the world, it lulled into complacency a world that was already trying to get out of its responsibility for taking proaction in situations that threatened world peace that were going on in 1928. For instance, in 1929, I should point this out, and this is what will give the Japanese military will give them a green light. In 1929, there is a Sino-Russian war again. The Chinese-Russians are involved in the fight. Oh, by the way, I have not mentioned in all of these 5-power, these 4-power, and these 9-power treaties, I'm not mentioned Russia once. Why? Because it was a Bolshevik country, a communist country, and they were excluded, which allowed them a free hand to do what they wanted and not have to even think about the covenant of the League of Nations, the World Court, or anything else. They will, in fact, attack China in 1929 and will be able to successfully appropriate some land. Well, they got away with it. The Japanese are aware of it. And in 1931, as we will see in a moment, the Japanese will do the same thing. It will begin their program of conquest of China. Part of the attacks on China, I should point out, in the late 20s and early 30s is because China seemed to have had a resurgence. China seemed to have recovered, at least partially, from that designation of being the sick man of Asia. That was some revitalization. That the government seemed stronger than it had been in years, until the Russians proved that to be a fiction, and which would now allow the Japanese in. Well, this notion of a defensive war will become obvious in a few years. But regardless of the concessions, I told you the Japanese are always looking for an opportunity. Okay? The Russians gave them the opportunity that perhaps they didn't need to be in the 553 treaty. And in fact, by 1935, the Japanese wanted out of the 553 treaty, or the five-power treaty of 1921. Now, perhaps the Japanese ambassador put it best when he said, you know, Ambassador Saito, he said, you know, when I look at this 553 treaty, you know what we Japanese see? We see Rolls Royce, and then a Ford. That the U.S. and the British both had Rolls Royces because they had 5.5, and then you come to Japan and it has a Ford. That's what the Japanese said they saw. And they decided that they wanted out, and they would get out of the treaty 2 years later. But by that time, their whole program of expansion through force was already well underway. Well, we talked about Japan, but Germany is also a problem for how do you deal with Germany in the 1920s. It wasn't so much that Germany, after the war, was a threat, because there was a pretty harsh treaty imposed upon the Germans. But German instability, Charles Evans Hughes pointed out in the early 20s, could upset a stable Europe if Germany were not somehow propped up economically, therefore if Germany were not stabilized. And what had happened was that in the Treaty of Versailles, once Wilson was shown not to speak for America, the Allies imposed some really harsh terms on the Germans. In fact, they saddled the Germans with a $33 billion war reparations bill. A $33 billion war reparations bill. Well, the Germans, very quickly, it was clear the Germans did not have the money to meet those obligations. And when they didn't, the French again jumped on them. In retaliation, and this is what the French wanted. The French, they liked the idea that Germany could not pay its debts because they wanted what? In any way they could, the French wanted to keep Germany as weak as it possibly could. What did Clemenceau say? In the post-war period, I said that Clemenceau said that his goal after fighting in the Franco-Prussian War and eating rats and cats because of the German invasion. The Prussians were once before they took the German name. That his goal was to never see Germany rise again in World War and in the end of World War I. So anything they could do to make sure Germany never rose again, the French would do. And so now, when the Germans couldn't pay their reparations, the French sent troops into the rich rural valley, stationed troops there, and also the rich rural, the valley was rich because of great natural resources too as well. This was viewed by Hughes as a potential economic and military, perhaps, catastrophe. Where would this lead? So the U.S. used its influence. In fact, it was the U.S. forced the French to renegotiate a debt payment schedule for the Germans. They ended in, well, what happened is because the French were arguing they did this because the Germans had defaulted on their debt payments. Now, the U.S. felt that with these incursions of the French, first now the movement to the Ruhr, what would it lead to? I mean, the Germans didn't have any money. You couldn't make, what is the old term? You can't squeeze blood out of is it a stone? I thought it was a turnip. Well, one of them. You can't get blood out of either one. You know, that the U.S. felt that it had to create, remember, stabilization. Stabilization, if necessary, through commercial intervention. So the U.S. got the French to renegotiate. And in fact, to renegotiate the terms of the repayment of reparations, but they went even further. Using, worked out by the former Vice President Charles Dawes, you had the Dawes Plan set up to help the Germans. They reduced the German debt from this enormous, expecting them to almost pay the entire $33 billion at one time. Now the Germans, the debt was now reduced to only $250 million annually. Okay, that the Germans would only have to pay $250 million annually. But even more so, the U.S. provided the Germans with generous loans. Again, this is an example of what? Of creating international stabilization by using American money. Well, this was as one person put it, a rickety plan, an unstable plan, because it depended on the continued expansion of world trade and the constant stream of American dollars to Germany. Now, what would happen when that stopped? It would create catastrophe. It would allow, as we would see, the emergence of one Adolf Hitler. Well, when we return, we're going to look at Latin American policies in the 20s, and then we're going to take it to the road to Pearl Harbor. Okay?